Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing study of American cultural history. In this series of lectures, we're going to turn our attention to American culture in the 1960s, a time of chaos in some instances, a time of excitement. We think about the culture of sex, drugs, rock and roll, and yet at the same time, it's the time of the Vietnam War, the feminist movement, the civil rights era, and many other things that created tension in the country as well. In this first lecture, we'll turn to a number of general reflections about culture in the 1960s and look at a few specific examples. The 1960s were a time of great turmoil and ferment in the country. The civil rights movement was reaching its peak, particularly after the 1963 March on Washington and Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. Cold War tensions also reached their height with the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The Vietnam War went from a topic that drew little attention in the early 1960s to a topic that no one could escape by the end of the 1960s. It was one of the great flashpoints in the country and ultimately became the source of tremendous opposition and protest. The assassinations of John F. Kennedy in 1963, Robert Kennedy in 1968, and Martin Luther King in 1968 as well, created a time of great confusion in the country and a time when arguments of nonviolence seemed to meet only with greater violence from the other side. It was a time of tremendous campus unrest, as college campuses across the country were sources of great interest, excitement, and learning, but also protest and controversy, and sometimes violence in their own right. We think about the 60s as a time when the drug culture flourished and hippie culture flourished. So popular culture in the 1960s burst with creativity, and at the same time, there was also the strong pull of tradition and order and conservatism, as many people were distressed by the atmosphere of irresponsibility and permissiveness that was suggested in much of the culture of the era. The world of advertising provides one window into viewing the culture of the 1960s, and in some ways it helped to pave the way for the rule-breaking pop culture of the era. By the late 1950s, some advertisers were breaking away from the formula of the 1950s that tended to just hammer home simple messages. Advertising was becoming more creative. One advertiser, named Bill Bernbach, orchestrated several of the most creative campaigns of the late 1950s and early 60s. In one campaign, for Volkswagen, he broke from the thinking that bigger is better and urged people to think small. He sold the Volkswagen Beetle as a cute love bug, not a big, expensive gas guzzler. In another innovative campaign, he had the Avis car rental company admit that they weren't number one, but as he said, "We try harder." The campaign, which met with some resistance from company executives, saw Avis capture 28% more market share within 2 years. Other advertisers introduced non-conventional characters, like the Pillsbury Doughboy and Charlie the Tuna. Some firms intentionally hired eccentric and wacky individuals. In this era, nonconformity was sought after, and novelty trumped predictability. This is contrary to the culture of consensus that we talked about for the 1950s. In some cases, the best way to sell a product seemed to be to point out its flaws. One memorable campaign for Benson & Hedges cigarettes showed the potential awkwardness of smoking an extra-long cigarette. In various ads, the cigarettes got stuck in elevator doors, mashed against a telephone, or wouldn't fit in a cigarette holder. The new trends in advertising seemed to indicate that Americans were tired of the traditional, tired and predictable way of doing things. Breaking from their old methods, advertisers employed comedy, pointed out their own flaws, made buyers of their products seem unusual, standing out from the crowd rather than fitting in, and even used rock and roll music. Some of the advertisements of that era send these messages very clearly. "Protest against the rising tide of conformity," said a Booth's Gin ad from 1965. "Join the Dodge Rebellion," said another in the same year. Thus, advertising ran hand in hand with the counterculture. One example was 7-Up, the soft drink, which was trying to catch up to Coke and Pepsi. The solution was an advertising campaign calling 7-Up the Uncola. This appealed to a hip, youthful, and rebellious generation. In the 1960s, the Cold War was still prominent in our thoughts, but elements of dissent became more commonly accepted and mainstream. The comedy of Bob Newhart was one example. He became popular in the early 1960s with a calm, deadpan, quiet style. As one description put it, he found the befuddling lunacy that lurks beneath the surface of deceptive calm. He was known as Mr. Clean. He avoided political material and profanity. He was born in 1929 in Chicago, worked all manner of odd jobs until about 1960, when Warner Brothers released The Button-Down Mind of Bob Newhart, after only hearing a few of his tapes. He hadn't even done stand-up to that point. He just sent in his tapes. Despite the doubts of some executives, it became a smash hit, topping the charts for 14 weeks. Almost overnight, Newhart became a star. His appearance and bland persona epitomized consensus conformity, but his comedy was anything but conformist. His routine bashed corporate America, the business world, and public relations. Other comedians were even more daring. Dick Gregory and other black comedians took the tradition of storytelling and verbal sparring that had originated on the plantations and popularized it in northern comedy halls. Gregory came from the slums of St. Louis. In January of 1961, he debuted at the Chicago Playboy Club. Appearing before mostly white audiences, he brought issues of the civil rights out into the open. "I sat at a lunch counter 9 months," he said in one routine. "When they finally integrated, they didn't have what I wanted." Newhart, Gregory, and other rebel comics were especially popular with the college crowd. Baby boomers who were now coming of age were experimenting with new directions in life and new subject matter. We'll be talking much more about the baby boomers and their college years as this lecture goes on. Many baby boomers were drawn to folk music. Folk music had a long history. It was tied to Appalachia, to hobos, union organizers, hillbillies, the blues, and others. Often untrained musicians took to playing acoustic instruments. Folk music had been non-commercial until 1958, when a college group called the Kingston Trio recorded Tom Dooley, a traditional folk song, and it sold over 4 million copies and reached #1 on the charts. Over the next 5 years, the trio added another 15 top 10 hits. In the late 50s and early 1960s, folk music was non-threatening, sung largely by harmless college groups with a lot of hand-clapping and smiling. In the early 1960s, though, many artists began to use folk music to send a message of protest. Performers like Peter, Paul and Mary, Joan Baez, Phil Ochs, and Bob Dylan injected political content into folk music. Dylan, in particular, became one of the most innovative forces in music throughout the decade. A college dropout, he became known in New York City for his acoustic performances as well as his lyrics. He addressed issues of racial injustice, the generational divide, and authority and peace. He took his guitar to the battlefronts in America, not worrying so much about record sales. He performed at the 1963 March on Washington, performing only a pawn in the game about slain civil rights leader Medgar Evers. So profound were Dylan's lyrics that he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2016. The movement beyond old traditions was evident in other areas of pop culture as well. The comic book industry received a jolt from the introduction of a series of new characters. The best were introduced by Stan Lee, the new editor at Marvel Comics. Attempting to compete with DC, which dominated the comic industry with characters like Superman and Batman, Lee introduced a new line of heroes. Typically, they were human and had flaws. In 1962, Stan Lee introduced the Incredible Hulk. This was a direct rebuke of the Cold War and nuclear weapons. The Hulk was created when mild-mannered Dr. Bruce Banner was exposed to gamma rays. The Hulk then sought to preserve his privacy and his survival, but he's inevitably pulled into battles that save humanity. As one Hulk cover asks, "Can a man with green skin and a petulant personality find happiness in today's status-seeking society?" Marvel's crowning creation, though, was Spider-Man, introduced in 1962. Spider-Man was Peter Parker, a lonely high school student. Bitten by a spider, he acquired superpowers. Not only did he now have great powers and begin battling the forces of evil, but Peter Parker also suffered through the normal pangs of adolescence, struggling over grades, finances, dates, love, and family squabbles. Spider-Man and Marvel reinvigorated the comics industry. Polls indicated that among college students, Spider-Man was as popular as Bob Dylan. Marvel continued to break new ground throughout the decade and beyond. In 1966, they introduced Black Panther, the first black superhero. By the end of the 1960s, DC comic characters were also confronting similar issues as those at Marvel, and the comics represented the social upheaval of the entire country. In our next lecture, we'll talk about culture and television in the 1960s and examine further some of these issues.